Hello and welcome to another episode of the CG Garage. This is episode number 329, featuring my long-lost friend, Ryan Laney, VFX Supervisor and the founder of Teus Media, which is an incredible company, which we get into quite a bit. Before I get too much into this, I want to say a couple things. One, we actually recorded this podcast twice because the first time we recorded it, we were having lots of technical issues. And after a long while, we decided to just quit and try it again once we solved those issues, which we mostly did. So you'll see us kind of rush through Ryan's past quite quickly because he kind of told the story to me twice, and we sort of like, yeah, and just kind of rushed through it, which is okay. But I do want to also note that he and I reconnected because of the Real-Time Conference. We were both speakers at the Real-Time Conference, which was great. A really great conference, and I highly recommend you guys go check it out. Go look up Real-Time Conference. I think there's going to be another one in November, and it was really fun connecting with him that way. But Kristen, what did you think of Ryan?
So he's just a cool person, just from like the work he's already done. Just he's worked on so many movies like Mortal Kombat 2, Ant-Man, Spider-Man 3. And then is that you guys met at DD with the Day After
DD,
Tomorrow?
yeah. We worked on Day After Tomorrow, yeah.
But the reason this whole podcast is about Welcome to Chechnya documentary, which is... This is crazy cool, like what he's doing and what he will do after this podcast. But basically, it was a group of activists there fighting for LGBTQ rights. And the David France made the documentary, but they needed to blur the faces and everything. So what you guys go into that is just... And how you had to he didn't blur the
faces. He couldn't blur the faces. What they basically did is they changed the faces using, and we get into this, similar technology that you would see in deepfakes. I'm just going to say that for simplicity for you guys to get the idea, but it's not actually deepfakes, and we identify why that is. But it basically helps hide the identity of these people whose lives are in danger. And it's quite amazing as we really get into the implications of what that is. And it's one of the first times, when we keep joking about visual effects and big movies don't really save lives. Well, they do. These were actually tools that were used to save lives. So much so that now basically Ryan has started his company and he's going to help journalists and documentary people to tell stories and be able to hide their identities in a really easy way, a good way. And it's kind of great what they're doing, they're basically, covering subjects like, human trafficking or whatever that is. So there's a lot of things that he can do in that area, and it was just absolutely fascinating. But Ryan is a really great guy. Again, I can't emphasize that enough. It was so amazing to reconnect with him. That's one of the things that was awesome, is that because of this podcast, I was able to say, I want to talk to Ryan. And then I talked to Ryan. He and I reconnected. We've been actually emailing each other back and forth ever since then, and just reconnecting about all kinds of amazing work. He's a brilliant, brilliant person, a very kind person, also a very humble person. So I just think he's really great. So sorry, I'm gushing about Ryan. I didn't mean to do that, but listen to the whole podcast and definitely check it out. And if you want to see the documentary Welcome to Chechnya, it is available on HBO Max now. So go check it out. Really great stuff. And congratulations on the amazing work that they did. All right, we've got a few announcements. Kristen, what's going on?
Yeah, so you can find these out at chaos.com/events. One will be tomorrow, June 8th, which is exploring V-Ray 5 for 3ds Max with Jonas Noel. And you can discover the new features of V-Ray for 3ds Max, plus workflow tips with an expert user. And then the day after, on June 9th, we've talked about this one. It is new product announcement webinar with SketchUp Studio. It'll be V-Ray 5 for SketchUp, and this one will be held in Japanese. And then June 18th, we have an online webinar and demo for introducing Chaos Vantage and Chaos Cosmos. So...
Perfect. Speaking of which, go to chaos.com. We do actually have an update to Vantage Update 1.3. It's available now if you guys want to check that out. There's a couple of great new things. So we've added support for two-sided materials, so you can do curtains and glowy lamps and all those types of things that you love to do with two-sided materials. And we also offer additional denoising options, new camera options, a bunch of updates, actually really great updates. So definitely check it out, Vantage 1.3. And it's still available for a free license if you'd like to give it a try for free. So really cool stuff. Again, check that out. If people want to know more about the podcast, Kristen, where can they go?
You can go to facebook.com/CG Garage Podcast or chaos.com/CG Garage. And if you'd like to watch us on YouTube, go to youtube.com/Chaos Group TV.
Perfect. And if you guys have any questions about this podcast or other podcasts, episodes that we recorded, or have suggestions of new ones, labs@chaosgroup.com is a great place to reach us at. And don't forget to leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts and share us with all of your friends and family. I'm sure your mom would love to hear more about what Ryan Laney is doing. Actually, she would.
Yeah.
It's a really cool. Again, I'm very excited about this episode with Ryan and the amazing work that he's done over at Teus Images, and about the incredible work that was done for the movie, or for the documentary, Welcome to Chechnya.
Welcome to another CG Garage, where the Chaos Group talks. You'll know it's over when the last bucket drops. We're gonna fire off rays in high dynamic range. We know that ambient occlusion is passé. Global illumination won't lead you astray. And while image-based lighting is really swell, you need to make sure everything has Fresnel.
You can start from scratch.
We're definitely going to start from scratch. We are definitely going to start from scratch, and we're going to get it, because the latency also is not perfect. So, all right. So here's what we're going to do. So for people listening, we've already done this, but we're going to recap it for you guys and give you an idea of what's going on and where Ryan and I met. But I think that's kind of halfway through the story. But what was interesting is that Ryan and I actually had similar pasts going on as well. So Ryan, tell us, give me a recap story of where your passion for 3D started, and where did that happen?
With CAD. And we found out on the last one that we went to school a few miles apart.
Yes,
which is pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So I was working out of high school for a design firm. They were all paper and Mylar, and sort of drug them into CAD with this hybrid approach to things of doing sort of pattern work with the computer-aided stuff, and then hand drawing the pretty stuff on top.
Right. So basically what you were doing, you figured out how to do 3D in CAD and do these, what they were calling back then, hidden line drawings, right? So it was basically just shows the line, and then it doesn't show what's behind the line, which was at the time took as long as ray tracing today sometimes.
Yeah, quite often. Well, yeah, actually it's longer than ray tracing if you think about it. Camera moves would take minutes.
Yes. It was a very, very tedious project.
So type in the rotation and translation values by hand, and that would put your camera where you wanted it. Yeah.
Yep. And it was very painful. And you also had we also talked about trying to draw perspective by hand. Did you ever try doing that?
Oh yes, actually quite often. That was how we did it. And it's really. I think I did it. May have done it in like high school drafting or something. We did perspective drawings. This is the first time I did it. But the first kind of venture into applying CAD to like a business model was doing these hidden line drawings with for perspective drawings, because it took so long, several days sometimes, to do a big house. In a perspective drawing, and you could do it in CAD in a couple of days,
right?
Which is now minutes,
right?
But yeah, and that led to buying up some software upgrades and some hardware upgrades, and I ended up with an SGI at one point, and tripped and stumbled into visual effects, which seemed
right.
Like
so you
how did at the time.
How did you get into visual effects? Remind me about that. What was the thing that sort of allowed you to sort of, I mean, obviously having access to an SGI automatically puts you in a skill set that other people require. But what else did you how did you get into?
Yeah, the SGI software. I had a TDI Explorer, which was Thomson Digital Image, and it was really fantastic at media and non-precision things. So I was still doing a lot of stuff in AutoCAD.
Yeah.
And so I had this like really expensive piece of hardware that was really good just for rendering. So I could, if I built something in CAD, then I could move it over and render it on the SGI. But I was looking for like how to maximize the use of that thing, because it was really awesome to have a supercomputer in the office. And that got me involved, sort of like learning how to use it. I was dependent on, and then became very active in the news groups. So, and there was one on Dynamation. I had the Dynamation package, which was really great. Santa Barbara Studios made it originally, and then Wavefront bought it. And got involved with effects through that. And Kleiser Walzak Construction Company in Los Angeles was looking for somebody to help out on a project, and nobody else was available. So so I got the opportunity and spent a couple years with them doing just fun B movies.
Now, like what? Tell us some of the movies you did.
Mortal Kombat 2, which was... yeah, great stuff. There's a new one out. I saw the trailer for last week. Fantastic work relative to what we did in the garage at in Kleiser's house in the Hollywood Hills.
Nice.
Yeah. Good times.
Now, you must have known Pat Finley, because I think Pat, I remember at one point he actually stayed at his house, like he was staying there for a few months when he was moving. Okay. All right.
No, so we were actually working out of the garage at the house.
Got it.
And then I think when we got it, it kind of moved up a notch and got an office on Yucca and Vine, a fantastic Art Deco building there, which I was thrilled about, working in an Art Deco building. And I think that's when Pat came down, and so he was working out of the Yucca office and then staying in the house. He and Greg Juby, I think. Another name from back then.
Yeah. So that's interesting. And this is I guess, so that was your first job at sort of going for Kleiser Walzak, great company. I think their main office was actually in Massachusetts, wasn't it?
Yeah. They actually had a fantastic deal with an art school there, and they had this amazing building that they were working out of, and they were pulling students straight out of school and teaching them, the next level, which was a great deal for everybody, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Pat was in that group. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And Pat also had an architecture background as well, I think, as well.
Funny. How did I not know this either?
Yeah. Well, you know how I know that? I'm reminded of that because I literally just got a text from Pat today, because he and I have the same accountant, and we've been complaining about our accountant not getting back to us by email. But that's a different story. But nonetheless, he reminded me about architecture. It's like, it was funny to do that. He lives in Florida now, by the way. So, so that's really interesting. But you had mentioned you'd worked at several other really kind of awesome studios, and there's some other cool projects before you and I met up at DD. So tell us a little bit about some of the other places you were working at.
The Windy Road of Ryan. Yeah. Let's see. So while I was at Kleiser, there was a woman that I worked with there whose boyfriend worked at Mannix. And so we got to talking about shaders. He was working on the Matrix, which at the time, I think nobody was quite sure what it was going to be. The first one.
The first one, yeah.
Okay. So Steve Demers was the guy that worked at Mannix, and he shader writer, and we strategized on how to create fleshy shaders for the big C, the harvester scenes.
Oh, right.
And, it was, again, like back then, everything was a cheat. You couldn't afford to ray trace depth or anything in anything that's wet's got like a specular layer and, depth layer. So we figured out we could slide UVs around and make it look like it was deep. Anyway, stupid techie stuff. So that got me introduced to Mannix, and then so I moved up to Mannix. Right after Matrix came out.
And that was in the Bay Area, right?
That was Bay Area, yeah, Alameda, California. Really fun. They had a naval air station on Alameda that had closed down one of the budget cuts things, government. And
wasn't that near the Mythbusters were up there too?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we also blew stuff up.
Yeah.
Because there was, we were literally at one point, we were the only company on a whole end of an island.
Right.
Like the last mile of a 3-mile island. And eventually there was like a company that painted buses, and so now it's quite populated. But it was fun being kind of like out in the middle of nowhere, kind of off the grid, and being able to shoot elements or do whatever stuff. That was good times there too.
Blowing stuff up is always fun. It's always
fun. Especially you're not supposed to be.
I remember I was jealous on iRobot because Eric Nash, who was a VFX supervisor, they went to shoot some elements, and this is when we had the stage at DD, and then they had still kept part of the stage segregated to actually do shoots, and they were shooting explosions on that stage, and so I'd be working, and my desk was right up against the wall, and so my desk would go like, just shaking.
So
and then,
you were down by the whale?
Yeah. Well, in the stage area, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And then at one point, my desk was shaking. And I said, I thought they were done with all the explosions. And then it's like, oh, no, that was an earthquake. But yeah, shooting explosions is fun.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Okay, so you're working on skin stuff. You're working on shaders, which was interesting as well. There was somewhat, I guess they were somewhat digital human beginnings of that kind of stuff that you were kind of doing at that point, maybe.
Yeah, if you want to call skin, transparent babies or whatever, that's, but what we did, the funny next project was called Bless the Child, and it had a swarm of hairless mole rats.
Right.
Which are, oddly enough, well suited towards skin shaders. So
excellent.
We spent another iteration on that. Really creepy sort of effect to be working with swarms of rats. There was a whole AI end of that too, which was interesting, of how do you get rats to swarm. And we were looking at the hardware back then was not, we've got more in our cell phones at this point. So everything, like I said, everything back then was sort of like struggling with resources and memory limits, and how do you render 500 things, or how do you render so we spent a lot of time figuring out efficiencies on getting stuff through. I worked with another guy at Mannix, Mauricio Bacchi, he's done a couple of fantastic short films. He and a woman named Dev Petty and I and a guy, John Daniel, did tests for the Matrix sequels, and we were able to render 10,000 Sentinels and 500 APUs and a handful of diggers all in one scene, and our rendering times were less than an hour, which we thought was fantastic. This stuff is real time in a game engine now, but at the time that was a really big threshold, is to get your renders down under an hour. So,
were you guys using Mental Ray back then on that?
That was actually the first Mental Ray project of the show, of the facility.
Right.
Yeah.
I remember that. That was pretty interesting. Pretty interesting. Okay, then you spent a little time over at ILM, didn't you? Or
I did. ILM was next. A few of us went from. There was like a Mannix ESC transition, and a few of us went to ESC, and a few of us went to ILM. And ILM was amazing. Those guys have 20 years on everybody as far as pipeline and just management of the process. I love how they always have a producer and visual effects supervisor or a team, and I've seen that now everywhere. But that was the first place where I saw this sort of like, well, I'm going to answer the technical questions, or I'm going to answer the how do we do it questions, and they're going to answer the the when can we do it,
Right.
and how much is it going to cost, and like separating those two conversations, I think is really valuable for the visual effects company and for the client, because it sort of separates this idea of like, well, price and abilities. I don't know. Yeah. Can you do it? Yes, is always the answer. Do you have enough time is a different question.
Well, that's the thing. The nature of visual effects generally is they want to see something at least back then, they want to see something they've never seen before. So your job is to do something you've never done before. So you have to say yes and just assume that you will try to figure it out along the way, right?
Yeah. Based on what we know, we think we're half a step away from what we can do today.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that was also, I remember that it was my first, my first few weeks or so when I worked in, my first job in visual effects was on Day After Tomorrow. And I remember going to Andy Waisler, who was my CG soup at the time. And he was like, well, let's try to do this. And I said, let's do it this way. And I said, well, I've never done that before. And he goes, well, neither have I, but that never stopped me. And I was like,
that is a great first lesson.
Yeah.
So were you on Day from the very beginning?
Very close to the beginning. I was on the modeling team. We were modeling the city stuff. So
Nice.
Nice.
Oh, that stuff was beautiful.
Yeah, it was, well, it was amazing about that. We can get a little bit into that, but, that was when I was an architect. I was working at Gensler. I was actually doing, architecture stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And then it was my buddy, and you remember Eric Hansen. He called me up and he says, we need someone to build buildings for like pretty much all of New York City for this movie called Day After Tomorrow. And as I go, okay, that sounds like it. And I didn't know Maya at the time. I lied. I said I did, but I didn't really know, or I'd never done it in production. And so I just kind of figured it out. And I was always so nervous. Oh, I was nervous that no one's going to figure out that I don't know anything. But apparently I did pretty well. So it was okay. But yeah,
you had an clear understanding of geometry. Yeah.
I had a clear understanding of geometry. And the first lesson, it was related to what you said. Like I quickly learned that in the actual architecture world, you have to have precision within like, an eighth of an inch. And in visual effects, you have to have precision within a couple of pixels, and then it doesn't matter. Like, it's like, it's fine. It's there. As long as it looks great, then it's good. So yeah. So it freed me up a little bit. And that was interesting for sure.
It's funny. Joel Hynek I worked with at Manix, who ended up bringing me to visual effects, to digital domain. But one of the first things I remember him telling me of like an aha moment was, I don't know, I spun up about something not being like accurate. And he said, if it appears to work, it does.
It's good. It's good.
Yeah.
It's really good. Well, that's interesting. So Joel, obviously, Joel brought you in for stealth. Or maybe was it before that? Was it on XXX or something like that?
No, it was for stealth. Yeah.
For stealth. Yeah. Okay. But you worked on Day After Tomorrow as well, too, didn't you? Yeah.
Yeah. Really interesting. Rolling back to ILM, the last project I did for them was Hidalgo, which was, I wrote a volumetric renderer for that. And so then you mentioned XXX, and that's what reminded me. I was humbled by Alan's work on the Avalanche for XXX. Like his,
this is Alan. What was his last name? Chapman. Alan. I think it's Chapman, isn't it?
That doesn't sound right to me. Alan,
doesn't sound right.
It's
Alan.
It's a single syllable, I think.
Right.
No, maybe it's two. I'll come back. Yeah. I'll remember it.
I'll remember it in a second. But he wrote what was known back then as Voxel Bitch. Because it was.
I wasn't going to say it.
Yeah, no, we can say it. We can totally say it.
It's called Storm or something now.
Then it got renamed to Voxel B, or in SIGGRAPH presentations they named it Voxel B, and then they named it Storm. And so yeah. But he was a very smart Canadian guy and then left the visual effects industry to write aquarium screensavers. That was what he wanted to do.
Really smart guy, and had his head in the right place of like what's important and, friendship and things like that, where it seemed to be, he valued those things a lot.
Yeah.
And I really like, but also like is from a programming perspective, I was feeling pretty proud of myself for having written this thing. And then I come in and I look at what he had done, and it was so well organized and so usable for anybody that, understood what was going on, to be able to go in and sort of like tweak numbers. And I was just really impressed by his work on that.
Yeah. I think
how that stuff was used forward. Yeah.
I think the first place that was used was actually on the first Lord of the Rings, and it was the horses on the waterfall coming down. Right. I think that was the first time it was used in feature film, but it was also obviously the big avalanche sequence for XXX and the stuff that was on Day After Tomorrow. So you were doing a lot of a lot of the fluid stuff. You were in the early days of fluid dynamics, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was all Doug Roble and his team. He had several developers on that. And I came in for Stealth, but Day was, I think, a year into the project, and they're still sort of working out the ideas about how to make this flooding sequence work. And so I was able to help out a little bit in the communication. I didn't actually do anything. I was just sort of like helped, as a, third party, somebody new, fresh eyes. Well, maybe if we did this, that's kind of all I did on that. But then I ended up going and to cover up the seams on those, I built a splash library that we're able to just a bunch of random variables and run 100 sims, and so the TDs could like plant a splash here, just pull from the library. So that was interesting.
Well, it also helped with the limitations of the resolution of the sim that you could do at the time, right? And just added detail in areas and hide the low resolution voxels that were involved.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that was pretty impressive, the scale of the sim. Like Doug and his team actually flooded New York. Down in Manhattan, but they which is even today it's no small undertaking. But I think you mentioned last time, like this was before you could parallelize fluid sims across multiple machines. So it was basically all they could do on a machine. It took them 6 or 7 days per sim.
Right.
So I think what was happening was the meshing of it, because it's this huge area and you've got to resolve to street level, and the meshing of the sim ended up with around the sort of the high frequency edges, some sizzling, and we just kind of chopped it off and then filled it in with reprojected those tangents out to the buildings, and now we've got a smooth surface that looks like it works.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that was really impressive. And I remember it was like, well, fluid sims, now we've finally figured out how to make them multi-threaded, obviously, and you can do fluid sims practically in real time these days.
Yeah, and now there's and I think DD is actually working on this as well. They're using AI to mimic sims. What should a sim look like? Right. So they're feeding it a bunch of sims, and then they're being able to like render in these real-time volumetric renders, which I saw something. I think it was DD a couple of months ago.
It's interesting because I remember very specifically Doug Roble himself. I did a podcast with him, and it must be, I think it must have been like 5 years ago that I did one. And I was asking him what are his thoughts on AI besides, what it can do. And he was saying specifically about simming. He goes, if you do a bunch of sims that are quote unquote accurate, and you say, here's the input, here's the thing, you just keep training it. It's going to go, well, based on what I've seen, best guessed is that it should look like this. and you can go way faster to do it that way.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Which is the whole nature of some of these AIs. It's just educated guesses, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's doing like a lot of the, you sparse bits of information, turning that into a better idea. I mean, that's a lot of what we do. I think experts in fields are people who have these, sparse sets of information in a particular field, and they're able to create complex ideas out of those. And I think the AIs are deep machine learning, anyways, are doing those. It's hard to call things intelligent, but they're certainly specialized. And able to make some really intriguing, complex associations between things.
Yes, for sure. For sure. So then, but then you and I reunited on Stealth when we ended up working on Stealth together at some point, right? So that was a big project that we were on.
Yeah, and so stage 2 for Doug's fluid sim was to couple the water sim with a gas sim. And so they, for that big fuel air explosion.
Yep, the camel hump sequence is what it was called.
Yeah. The fuel was a fluid sim, and then the fire was a gas sim, and they were coupled in a way that was somewhat accurate. Which is, again, very oppressive for the level of sort of computing power at the time for simulation. That was a massive undertaking.
Yeah, I remember. I was actually working on the lighting on the camel hump sequence, which is kind of a crazy sequence if you think about it, but as a story is concerned. But it was quite an amazing feat in terms of fluid sims. But yeah, that's really cool. That's really cool.
I think the coolest thing I remember from that project was actually was it Kelly Port that was flying he had like a joystick and he was actually flying sorties through the mountains, and they actually used those as the data for the buck that they shot on location.
Oh, right.
So yes. It was basically like a game engine driving a gimbal that then drove the production. But the good thing there was the sort of movements from the buck and the movements through the mountains were they're tied together. So it was, again, accurate.
Yeah, I do remember that. And it was good because then we had a camera that worked for both in a physical world and the other one. But I also remember some of the moves that were done were slightly dangerous for the occupant of the buck.
Like that's the spider cam flying by.
Yeah, like it's good. You're going to either, break a finger or get really nauseous or a situation like that. Yeah.
I think somebody told me that the buck could pull 3 Gs.
Yeah, that's pretty bad. That's pretty bad.
It was very, very, very. They were very. They had limiters that would show up. Things would in the UI would go red if they went past levels or something like that.
Right, and especially we're putting actors or stunt people, not test pilots into these things. So yeah, it wasn't. You had to be.
It's like Formula One racers have stronger neck muscles than everybody else.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You brought this up with simulation. I worked at a company called Sway, and we had we did a lot of car commercials, but we had a fantastic car simulator that allowed us to do perfect car motions. And it was the same kind of idea. You just drove it like a video game. But we had all the physics built in, like, okay, here's a Subaru, here's an all-wheel drive system. We had everything. It was an amazing system. But the people always wanted actions out of these cars that were like not physically possible, right? And so it was like, okay, well, I'm putting super glue on the tires for something, so it's like you would literally pass out. It's like, well, that looks good. And it's like, you have no idea how fast we're turning around that corner. I mean, you would pass out. So it's always a little bit different, what you expect. I mean, that's the argument, right? You keep talking about, it's like, it looks really CG. It's like, well, it gets directed to such an extreme of impossibility to the point that that's why it looks CG,
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of these times, visual effects supervisors who have a healthy history and education in cinematography know that you can put the camera closer to the ground and it will feel like you're going really fast and you're doing 15 miles an hour.
Right. Like most Michael Bay films, those chase scenes are going like 15, 20 miles an hour.
Yeah. And they're safe and, the people are involved and it's, and you back a camera out and you've got 2 superheroes that are jumping around like, Gumbies and like, I don't know why it doesn't look real. A lot of it is cinematography, like how to cut together a fight scene is a very specific piece of artistry in filmmaking, I think.
And editing too. Very clever editing
absolutely,
too.
Absolutely.
Well, that's very, very true. Very, very true. Okay. So Stealth, but then I think you might've gone to Sony for a brief stint as well, right?
10 years, somewhere in there.
Oh, so not
Brief
that short.
No. I mean, in the scheme of things, in if you're talking about dinosaur time, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
No, Sony was amazing. Like their sort of like desire to throw resources at projects was pretty impressive. But we did some fun stuff. We got to tear up a house for Zathura. We got to Aviator was amazing because that was a historical biography film. Right. Not quite a documentary, but it was really fun to do. Get back to doing something that was accurate. So we had to do a period accurate Long Beach. They shot models for the spruce goose, and then we had to integrate CG with the spruce goose model and water and splashes and all that stuff, and CG clouds, which we actually we put on sprites because we couldn't afford to do rendering because it was such a small project. So
wow.
We put all those clouds are sprites that we shot clouds and and populated the scene. So what else did we do? Giant 50-foot robot made of toasters and microwaves. We did all the energy stuff in G-Force. Green Lantern.
Nice, right.
So that was probably the biggest project, which was, I know in the theater people didn't love it as much as some of the other superhero films out, but it was really fun to get to sort of like play with energy for that project because it was in everything.
Right.
So,
and you got to do that all in LA, right? You didn't move to
Albuquerque.
Okay.
Yeah. We had teams in Albuquerque. Yeah. Talk about remote learning advances. They had, I'd say the coolest thing about their adaptation of remote was that we had a life size in the production here and a life size in the production there, and they were on all the time. Because a lot of what you miss about remote learning is you're disconnected from people. And so if I was in the production office and somebody was in the production office over there, I could see them and go, oh, hey, I needed to talk to you about that thing. And then we could have a conversation right there in front of the TVs.
It's like a run-in, but it's because it's always on, right?
Yeah.
You don't turn it on. I got it.
Yeah. Smart idea. So. Yeah.
What if they only built half the office and then they had life sizes of the other half, but then it was all screens? So it'd feel like it was like you would look into another world that way.
That would be great. And wire it up to like
so it looks like you're looking into the other office. You just can't cross the barrier because it's in there, but it feels like it's just the other half of the office.
I guess you could do that with a Mandalorian set these days.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking. It's like, it's like, oh yeah, it's like, hi. And then you can touch hands, but they're like just you're touching a screen. It'd be kind of interesting. That's really cool. So Sony was fun. You did a lot of stuff there. I think you even worked on Spider-Man 3 for a little bit, didn't you?
Oh yeah. Totally forgot about that. We did some Goo, which was another exercise in resource limitation. That was also fun because it was cross-departmental. So we built, tools for every department to be able to interact with this atomic unit, which was a string. And every department had like their tools that could operate or, get data from the string. So that was a lot of fun. First amorphic character to get nominated for an Annie Award, a SIFA. I don't know if you're familiar with SIFA Hollywood's a big group here in Los Angeles and Hollywood. They do a lot of work around animation.
And the Annie Awards, I definitely know.
Yeah. Same group.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. Okay, all right. And from what I remember, you started doing a little bit more consulting after that for a little bit, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Really just, this was around, I guess Green Lantern was 2010 or something. I can't remember exactly, but this is when, democratization of computer graphics was sort of getting everywhere. And a lot of small companies that were wanting to do visual effects for commercials, and they're, buying a unit, and then they don't really know, like, okay, now what? So, because there is a lot of, production management that goes on top of visual effects, which people don't quite think about, and a lot of people don't really talk about. But okay, back to your idea of well, we've never done this before. How do we get there? You do have to pace it. You do have to pace. I don't know. So I was really just helping smaller companies. To sum it up in the smallest bit, is helping smaller companies figure out that workflow for them. Mm-hmm. And for that, I felt like it was very interesting to see, well, everybody can't do it like visual effects does it because their mindset is different. I worked for one company that was a print company. And they've got 50 years of doing print work. And to sort of come in and say, well, in visual effects, you do it this way. That's not really the right approach. And I guess they had tried that with a couple other people. I'm like, okay, well, based on your technology and your workflows, here's how you might adapt what you already know into this new thing, rather than trying to retool your entire company. And so that's this sort of like hybrid place where you're taking one idea and putting it in another domain. There's some real magic in that. Mm-hmm. Being able to, I guess, like you're, building buildings, having the architectural knowledge, coming in and being able to operate in visual effects because your foundation is in building buildings. Whereas if somebody had hired out like a character modeler, those buildings would have looked different. Yeah.
Well, it definitely became, it was interesting that it's interesting you say that, because it definitely became an asset for me. I know that, when we were at one point, we were modeling an actual building that was represented, but then we had to model a bunch of other buildings. Those are just random buildings. And it was very clear that no one knew what the hell they were doing because all these buildings didn't look right. And so Andy, who is also an ex-architect, he says, Chris, why don't you take control of some of this stuff? And so I actually built all the stuff that was like the background buildings, and I had all these different things. And I had to teach him. I was like, no, that's a party wall. That's, there's a mechanical floor here. That you don't just put windows all the way up. It doesn't make any sense. You have to have these, you have to have all these different things. And then like a party wall in New York, you see how the little windows are like that. That's because there's a staircase there. You just had to teach them all these things. And like, oh, and it became.
And then it looks natural.
Then it looks natural, right? But I realized, and then it was interesting because I ended up doing more design, quote unquote, on Day After Tomorrow than I did at anything at Gensler. Because at Gensler, I was just handed designs by architects that say, make this a picture, right? And then for them, it was like, we don't know how to make a building. Can you design it? I was like, sure, And it was kind of a
dream
different
job.
Yeah, it was great. It was great, And so I do, and I still, it's still great. But I also, and it's just like you're talking about, I got to learn so much every day because there's always something new that someone was learning, right? So I would go to you and you're like learning about splashes or fluid dynamics or whatever else is going on, or asset management. And so you're always learning something. I loved learning. So that was great. That was definitely great.
Keeps us strong.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. and not only strong, but also like not bored.
True.
Yeah. Okay. So I do want to get to the big project that I want to talk about, which is Welcome to Chechnya and that process. So I should let people know, obviously, what I learned about the project actually because of the real-time conference, which is how I reconnected with you, and I checked out the documentary, and it's really, really interesting, especially one, the subject matter, two, the technology, and how the technology served the subject matter. And considering it's a documentary is even more interesting, and that all of this comes together. But I really want to thank Jean-Michel for doing this. So tell us a little bit of a story. How did that project come about? And then we can talk about the semantics, which you and I started to do before all the our stream breakdown. And I want to really get into the semantics of what that's about. But tell us how that project started, how you were introduced to it, and then tell us a little bit about what that documentary is and what you did for it.
Yeah. So the documentary. Well, let me just start with what the documentary is. It chronicles LGBTQ youths in Chechnya who are being persecuted for their lifestyle. It's against the law. People are being abducted off the street, and unfortunately, because it's against the law, nobody can say, "Hey, I was pulled off the street and tortured for 2 weeks," because their next question is like, "Why?" And then then they're in trouble. They also have honor killings in the culture. So the governments are basically torturing these people to get their contacts, and then they're handing them back to the family and saying, "You should do something about this problem child," and that something is usually not very good for that person. David France had heard about this purge that was going on, and he went to Chechnya, and he convinced the people that ran the Underground Railroad to let him film, which is amazing. Talk about people who can speak their way into a situation.
Very dangerous situation.
Very dangerous situation. Yeah, he won a couple of awards for Courage Under Fire, or filmmaking under fire. I can't remember what the exact was, but yeah, really amazing. Went in, was able to shoot this footage, and he's like, "I don't know how I'm going to make this happen, but I promise you I'm not going to release anything until you feel like you're protected." And he told that to all the subjects in the film. And
their identity, more specifically.
Their identity, yeah. Because it turns out it's not just like that they went through the escape and were able to find asylum and something. They've actually had cases where people found asylum and then were recaptured and brought back to the homeland for cleansing. So really scary stuff when you start talking about like state actors and things like that. So there security protocols and all that was pretty intense. So David, he shot for 18 months, and for the last year of that, he spent trying to get something to work. They tried rotoscoping and doing art filters, and they realized that just accentuated the people's caricature instead of hiding them. And
they tried to do something like a Scanner Darkly type effect.
Scanner Darkly like effect, yeah. And I think before he met me, or shortly after he met me, before we found a solution, he'd had a conversation with the production. He's like, "This might never see the light of day." So they were kind of in a corner with a story that needed to be told, but couldn't be told with people that were in it. Like they couldn't be seen on film, couldn't be seen in the finished product. And so it was a really interesting combination of, applying different domains of visual effects to documentary filmmaking. This level has never been done before, and resource limitations. Documentary filmmaking, again, they don't have a budget for this kind of work anyway.
And you couldn't just do like blurred out the faces or pixelated the thing, because sometimes you have like 3, 4, 5 subjects all in the shot, and it's just like it wouldn't make any sense, right?
Yeah, well, there's that. The biggest thing with the blurry faces is they can be undone now if you have enough information. Yeah, it's computing power is intense, and if you give enough information, and sort of like, well, I'll give you an example. Hubble telescope makes a bunch of pictures every time it crosses the same part of the sky. And by sort of like knowing where the Hubble is and knowing where it took the picture, and that sort of a slight discrepancy from pass to pass, it's able to fill in the pixels. And so you basically end up getting a super resolution if you have enough frames. So if you've got a picture of somebody and they're mosaiced out, which a single frame doesn't give you any information, but as soon as that image is moving, you've got these sort of discrete samples of the pixels underneath, and you can reassemble. Blurs can be undone, not as much to a specific picture, but enough to find an identity.
So like my Pixel phone, not to digress, but my Pixel phone, when I zoom in, it actually uses the jitter to find all the pixels in between the pixels and tries to give you a higher. Yeah. Yeah, it uses the jitter of your hand. It uses the jitter of your hand to an advantage to actually fill in all the pixels in between.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant.
Okay, so blurs can be undone. So that's not going to be a solution that he feels that's going to protect them enough at this point.
And
right?
you completely lose the connection to the person. So
and yes, and you need somehow to recognize the people. Yes.
Yeah. Typical documentary filmmaking is you put somebody in shadow, or you make them wear a Halloween mask, or you obscure or you shoot around their face. You just show like their hands, or the widget on the desk, or whatever the case is. So, but we're humans. We're from birth. We have the ability to recognize faces. Supposedly, it's in our retinas.
Right.
Or in the wiring, somewhere in there. But we gain so much information from facial expressions, and to take such a heavy film and abstract the humanity from it, really, I think I agree with David that it just wouldn't have worked. So our goals are sort of like, well, the thing that they set was we want to obscure these people so well that their parents wouldn't recognize them, which we thought was a hypothetical, but turns out it was real. And in the process of like understanding the weight of this film, we realized we also needed to maintain their humanity. And so that it's really interesting when you get constraints that there is this little small space in between. How do you sort of like solve? It just becomes an interesting equation. Our first idea was to warp the faces. If we could get like a good 3D track, then we could, change the face geometry as though we were changing the bones underneath, and that would change the identity. It would certainly change the identity for any AIs or any, computer vision versions of things. But,
why is that? Why does that help? Just I know, but like explain to the audience why changing the structure of a face.
Machines when they're identifying people, they use relationships between our facial features to understand who we are. And so there's certainly it used to be like a 17-point mapping. I'm sure it's gone up by then, but pretty accurate. Like you can be searched in the government databases within a minute. If they have a good understanding of your facial structure, and just
so it's a
determine that you're not
relationship
on the watch
between
list.
eyes and nose and mouth and forehead and eyebrows, that
and
kind
ears
of
and
ears, yeah. Okay.
So we thought, based with that knowledge, we thought we could, alter somebody's, and we did this test where we took Obama and we turned him. Let me back up a second. There's this picture out of University of Glasgow which shows faces of people around the world, and it's great because it is, it's, I don't know, 30 or 50 countries, and you're like, oh, I know somebody from Poland, and they look just like that. So it's interesting, like how regional we are. And I grew up in Houston and I've lived in Los Angeles and spent some time in New York, and so you forget that everybody. Wherever you go, everybody doesn't look different like they do in these port cities. Right. San Francisco is the same way. Is that you just you kind of get used to everybody looking different and don't realize that there are really regional looks. And so we thought in this idea of moving bones, we thought if we could move like somebody from one region in the world to another region in the world. So we took Obama and we turned him into mainland Spain, kind of like geometry. And it worked, but it looked like his cousin. So we thought that didn't quite settle up.
Looks like Spanish Obama.
Looks like, yeah. Like the guy in the, the guy in the restaurant. That looks like Spanish Obama.
Yeah.
So that was a good sort of like proof of concept. And then to take it a step further, we rolled in this idea of a stunt double face replacement, but we're reversing the process. We're putting the stunt face on the real person.
Right.
And around the same time, we were looking at style transfer, and there was a 2-minute Papers video.
I know those
I'm sure you're familiar with the series. Fantastic series of like summaries of work that's out there. And it was a work on style transfer, which I was working on anyway. And it had in that, it referenced a paper, and in that paper there was one picture of a face and a piece of artwork of a face. And I was like, well, if you could do that, what if the eyebrows were brush strokes, and, what if lip shapes were more like, a Rembrandt versus a Picasso. So, we found a paper that implemented one of those. It was, I think it was called Semantic Style Transfer, Deep Image Analogy, 2017. And sort of hacked together this attempt to make that work, and we were able to apply style transfer in the domain of faces to do this idea of moving bones or changing somebody's identity by sort of like changing their face a little bit rather than going full Scanner Darkly.
Right. So what became a little bit of a conversation, because this has been in a lot of articles about it, is that they say they used quote unquote deepfake technology. Now, the deepfake technology is interesting because your argument is that deepfake, the term deepfake is more about, is somewhat related to its use case and not necessarily the technology that you're using. And you don't necessarily want to associate what you're doing with some of those use cases that are being used. And I can understand that. So let's talk a little bit about how you qualify in the semantics between those terms. Because there is a relationship, there's similarities, but your use case is clearly very different from what you were calling deepfakes. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I have to qualify this by saying I recently discovered Play-Doh, and so I like the idea of talking about the idea of things. And so it's more of a philosophical conversation than a hard position. But the difference is for us that there was great care taking in making sure that we had maintained journalistic integrity. So right. we added a blurry oval around the outside to tie it to the visual language of the blurry oval, but also to be a visual indicator to the audience. Hey, we've done something here. This is a documentary, and we don't want to try to fool you. We're not creating a fake piece of media here. We're creating an authentic piece of media here that happens to use visual effects. So, so there's this open dialogue with the audience. The people that were in the Underground Railroad and some of the activists that were supporting that system were aware that the things were being filmed, and they were aware that this film was going to come out and that they were going to be covered. And they actually, David France went back to everyone in the film and got buy-off from them and said, are you okay with what we've done here? And they were all very excited about, being able to get their story out and not be, the front person. And then also the volunteers that we shot data of to become the Veils, they were actually activists, mostly in New York, in the LGBTQ community, or mostly in, and they were, offering up their image as like a human shield. So, so they were very aware of how their image was being used.
So let's go through the process. You mentioned a little bit, the research you did. So explain the process of how you actually did it. I know it's I can pretty much guess, but tell people like exactly the steps you have a destination person and a source person, right? Kind of in a sense. And so explain a little bit how that works and how you train the data and how the final effect is done.
Sure. We have the subject in the film, and then we have the face double. And the face
double is a volunteer out of New York who says, I'm offering myself up as a shield for you.
Yeah. So we did when you're figuring out something, you don't know what's going to work and what to not.
And how do you pick the two? Like what were the things? Like if you're picking the second person, the shield person, you want them to be someone that would work, but also not at all look like that person. Like what are the criteria that you did there, right?
Oddly enough, we went by body weight.
By body weight, okay.
Yeah, or relative body weight. Like if somebody was shorter or taller, we didn't go like absolute numbers, but general like body composition.
Okay.
Works very well. So, jaw lines get sharper when people are more thin and more round when people have extra weight. And so it turns out, we tried a bunch of different things, but it turns out like if there was any single, like if I just sum it up in a single term, it's body composition.
Interesting. Okay, so now go back to the process of how you get to do the two things.
Yeah, we shot data. We did taking knowledge from visual effects and how you do a stunt double is you often have the actor go through the motions or step into the scene where the stunt double was doing the stunt so that you get their lighting in the same sort of like similar lighting to what you're shooting. Like for Ant-Man, they had Paul Rudd actually pantomime all the actions of the fight scene, and then it was very easy to sort of like pull frames from that and map them onto the fight sequence.
Right.
So that was the idea, and we went through the film, kind of selected all the different lighting scenarios that we needed to hit. So there was, everything from bright daylight to nighttime lit by car lamps.
Right.
And so we scheduled out for 23 subjects, a full range of lighting scenarios, and sort of like picked which subjects or which activists need to be shot for which lighting scenarios. But that data capture session lasted a week. We generated about 8 terabytes of data with an array of 9 cameras, which you turn 9 cameras on and they fill up disk space really quickly. Mm-hmm. And then we wrote software to pair the view angles from the film with the view angles from the database, and then use that. So our first step into like a lot of these AI deep learning models use generalized forms. Like, let me just go pull a bunch of pictures off the internet and I don't care what they are because they're a face. We were very specific about the faces that we're feeding into the system, that they were already very close in lighting. Selective training. Yeah. Well, it's attention, I think is the word that they're using these days. And if you're if we're paying attention to something, it's better because we're paying attention to it. So if you give the machine information sort of in an attentive way, it can do a better job. So we were able to pull off, I think at the time, so deepfakes came out around the same time we were starting our development cycle on this, and they were 64 pixels, and we were able to do 2K face image out of our system. So it's a soft.
Were you guys using GPUs?
Oh yeah. Unfortunately, they were really expensive because that was in the Bitcoin mining boom, and everybody was buying GPUs, and you couldn't find them, or you couldn't. So there was these NVIDIA 2080s were a really good sort of like workhorse. They weren't the highest end of the time, but they were low-ish power consumption for that sort of like level of computing. And they have really like, I'd say that all the GPUs we had going solid for 4 months,
right,
nonstop,
right.
And I didn't have one failure in that, which isn't surprising for modern hardware company. But
nice.
You don't really think about using GPUs other than like a game here or there, or for a render here or there, but to actually like put them into number crunching mode for weeks at a time.
Well, it's funny, and kind of funny you say that because NVIDIA says the difference between the GeForce line and the Quadro line is that the Quadro line can run for months, but it looks like you got the GeForce computers to run for months as well, which is also what the Bitcoin guys are doing that too. So.
Yeah. RTX, so it's a little different than the GTX for the main GeForce line. But,
that's the RTX.
They're still. Yeah.
Okay, so you're training the data, you've got the data, and then you did, like you said, you were very, and it's very visible in the film, and it says it at disclaimer at the beginning, the identities have been hidden to protect their lives. And you can see, basically, like, you kept the comp not so clean to make sure that people are aware that this is not a real this is not the actual representation of that person, right?
We added the soft edge.
Right, you added the soft edge.
It's called an underblur because it goes on the face underneath the veil that gets added on top of it. So it did help us obviously to blend the edges because it is new technology and we were sort of pushing the limits of what image we could create. But also we really, really like the idea of tying it to what traditionally is known. Because when you watch in the news and you see a blurry oval, you instantly know that person's being protected. And we thought that was a really, really strong visual language.
Yeah, for sure.
So, but yeah, I mean, as far as like what we were doing versus deepfakes, I think that to call any, do you call any face replacement that has deep learning as part of its process a deepfake? Or do you call any image that has its processing a deepfake?
Honestly, this is a problem. This is a media problem, right? Because you could basically listen, people are calling LED walls virtual production when they're not, right? They're a green screen replacement, right? They're not. They have nothing to do with virtual production, which is all about motion capture and everything else, right? So, you're and that's fine, but they're going to call it virtual production. And at one point you go, well, okay, it's virtual production. But the news articles that are coming out about what you guys did is saying like, oh, they used deep fakes for good, right? So the term deep is because they're using deep learning or, deep networks or deep neural networks to do these things. And then fake is because they're faking the identity, which is technically just similar to what you guys are doing. Right. And I'm not saying you guys, you're not saying that this, but the problem is that right now, the term deepfakes has been highly associated with putting someone else's identity into subjects that they're not in. Right. And without necessarily their authority or their authorization. And that I can understand that you don't want the same technology that's used for revenge porn to be used for what you're doing. And that's because clearly it's different things. And I don't necessarily want to say that's the case. But what I do want to say is that the technology is very interesting technology and people wanted to make it illegal because they don't understand what it can do when really it can be used for a lot of good, which is also what you guys are doing. So, and that's something I just want to clarify. It's like, don't outlaw the technology, outlaw what you're doing with the technology in some ways, right? Revenge porn should be illegal, but I don't think protecting someone's identity and being able to maintain that person's facial expression, which is the brilliant part of what you guys did. These people are very emotional people and they have, when they see each other, when they're worried, when they're scared, you see all of that. And you see all of that in such a clear way while still masking their identity. And it's so authentic, which is also great because it's a documentary. So this is really, it's an all-win situation. So to me, I think you guys succeeded in spades. And hopefully you guys get a lot of recognition for what you guys did.
Well, thank you. Thank you. There was a scene with Anne, with a young lady who's spending her first night ever in her life alone in this strange apartment in this strange city. And she is going through, there's a scene where she's going through the emotion of that, completely nonverbal. But you can read every concern, trying to sort of laugh it off. No, not really. I'm really this is an uncomfortable moment. It's really, we were impressed the first time we saw it working because of how well the sort of the authenticity of the moments came through.
Right.
We were really fortunate in having the opportunity to solve the problem and then luckily having enough knowledge from enough different places to find the solution. Yeah.
Well, it was definitely very powerful. And you did it. You guys, like I said, did a great job. Now let's quickly talk about security. You must have had some serious, there are governments that want this information. How did you protect that information?
State actors. Yeah, that's sort of, luckily, Public Square Films, the company that, the production company, had some security experts on board. And so they had already worked out data transfer protocols, how they dealt with the cameras, camera data cards, how they dealt with disk drives that they were carrying around with them. It's illegal in some countries to have an encrypted drive on you at any moment. So so they had, backstories of why they were in places. They had alternate versions of things in case they, had to hand over a camera. So they they luckily had a lot of intelligence for how to operate in that space. And so when we came on, we built a secret lab from scratch, and everything's air gapped. So we're like, well, if the plug is unplugged, they can't get to us.
Right.
No cameras, cell phones, smartwatches. There were no devices allowed in the lab that could record. So nothing that could record was allowed in the lab. And that really, it surprisingly, it gives yourself some peace of mind. Because otherwise you're always worried about what's the vector, how do they get in, how are they gonna find? But if you just say, well, no, here's the rules, it's much easier to manage. It's harder to get information in and out, like hand carried drives, but I've done that in my career, so it's not that unheard of. And then and it's usually like, well, when I'm in New York, you'll give me this information, and when you're in Los Angeles, you'll give me this information, and so yeah. But you do have this little thing in the back of your head that's like, what? Am I on radar? Am I on somebody's radar?
Yeah, I bet.
So
I'd have some concerns as well, for sure. Well, that's fascinating. Well, hopefully, the documentary, like I said, is really good and serves a real purpose and brings awareness to something that I think is extremely important. What was your feeling when it was done, and how was it received for the work that you had done?
It was received. We were a supporting role. Mm-hmm. So the film was a powerful film because Tyler Walk, the editor, did a fantastic job at weaving these human stories in and out of this very stressful situation. Mm-hmm. So he says it's basically a love story that's set in this tragedy. But I think that people responded well to it because it was a good story and because it was an important human rights story. And we felt really good that we played a supporting role in helping that story be more powerful because the audience could have a stronger connection to the audience.
Right.
There's a moment in the film where the veil comes off of somebody who reveals himself to the press in order to file a lawsuit. And there was a little conversation about how that would happen. And Tyler and the editor Max Anderson and David, I think they made a good decision about how to do that and where to do that. And that was a very big moment. We screened at Sundance, and that was a very big moment for the audience because you understood that people were covered. You see the blurry oval. You understood what was going on, and now you see actually how different the face looks underneath.
So how well protected they are in a sense. You basically see them.
Yeah. So there was an audible gasp when we screened it at Sundance. So there were 3 screenings there, and really powerful moment. So I felt like that was a really fantastic. Visual effects is always in support of the story. Everything, all the filmmaking.
Ideally, yes.
How do you tell you about a better story? So it was really a fantastic feeling to have that play out. Like we did this and we did all this hard work, and it was really like stressful, and you're spending a year with this footage. Terrible stuff is going on but to see that there was a reaction, and then now since then, in the last year, they got an audience at Parliament. They got some mentions in U.S. Congress. The U.S. has changed some policy towards Chechnya. So it is amazing to be part of a project that is affecting change in the world for positive. And I might have the human rights bug. Now I'm going to be one of those people. But the idea of being able to use our tools of technology to help humanity is just, I'm over the moon about it.
Yeah. we always used to joke. It's like, visual effects. It's not like we're saving lives or anything. It's like, well, now you are. Good for you, Ryan.
Yeah, amazingly.
Yeah.
It's not like
using a similar technology that's been villainized and being criminalized. You're using that same technology to save lives, and I think that's a wonderful thing. You're basically showing technology as something. If you want to make it for good, it's really good.
Yeah,
So
a stick can be a lever or a bat.
Yes. Thank you.
Or a club. Yeah, it's not. You don't outlaw the stick.
Right.
You outlaw hitting people with sticks.
Yes, exactly.
So I think, and I think we spent a lot of time and a lot of conversations about media integrity, and sort of there was a lot of broadcast in the world about fake news and fake media, and we were really careful to avoid anything that was inauthentic in that sort of a way. Yeah. Yeah, it was funny. I saw 2 articles this week. One was somebody's figured out. So they're doing all this medical research, deep learning in medical research, right? To identify cancer and identify lung disease. And some white hat hackers took a machine learning model that could identify brain tumors and was able to add a brain tumor to an image that didn't have it. A 3D CT scan. Was able to fabricate a CT scan with a brain tumor in it, and was able to fabricate another CT scan that had a brain tumor, was able to remove that and, put in its place a CT scan, a 3D CT scan that was, for all intents and purposes, didn't appear to have the tumor.
Right.
So that's, I think if you do it for research, it's one thing, but if you start to do, like, that's a deep fake. If someone were to hack medical records and add and remove elements to create or,
to give you the illusion of.
Yeah. Oh, we have this scan and it says you have a brain tumor, so we have to open up your head and I don't know. In the medical industry and profit motives, who knows what's going to happen with that? So,
right.
So that's where deepfakes becomes dangerous. The other was, I saw just today deepfakes of cities, aerial satellite photography, being able to change the layout of a city. And so if I think the real danger in it is in the real danger of anything when you live in an environment where you can't trust any information, that becomes a very strange place to live. So we've been lucky in our last 20 or 30 years as we've had access to this amazing amount of information, which prior to that you only got what you were told, and now you feel like you've got the internet and you can go find the information for yourself. And so it's going to be interesting what happens when anything can be faked.
Right.
Which I guess you can fake a satellite photograph with Photoshop.
Right.
So is it really that different? I don't know. I
don't know. And it happens all the time though. But it happens all the time. I remember it was years and years and years ago, but it was some photo that came out, and it was on a bunch of networks, but we just happened to see it on CNN, I think it was, but all the networks picked up the same picture, and it was some guy who took a picture, and it was some explosion that happened. I believe it might have been Beirut, but it was a massive explosion. Karen and I looked at it. My wife is also a visual effects artist, and she looked at it and she goes, "They cloned the crap out of the smoke. It's the same smoke everywhere." And it were like, they just made it way, way bigger in Photoshop, and it looked terrible. But everyone was like, "Look at that huge explosion!" And then all the news outlets were broadcasting it. And we're like, and then, we wrote a letter to, I think, whoever we were on. And then the next day it was like, how can we trust journalists or photojournalists? It's like, well, they're faking
multiple
pictures.
Sources, right?
Yeah.
Multiple sources.
Yeah. So it's just a thing.
Real-time information from multiple sources. I don't know. But
it's very difficult.
It's a big question. I think it goes back to what you were saying is the crime is how you use the tool. And if you outlaw and have, I don't know, penalties for people who generate fake media or who publish fake media, then you create a downward pressure against people just taking an image and throwing it up on the air before they even verify whether or not it's real.
Yeah. Well, there are efforts, as you're well aware, there are efforts out there to try to authenticate deep or fake information. There are lots of efforts. There's a lot of
With
digital
deep machine learning.
Deep machine learning. They reverse engineer it. Yeah. So I did actually had Wael on, I forgot his last name. I'm sorry. He's a fantastic guy, about specifically using his technology to identify what's been faked and not faked, right, in some certain ways. And he it's the same process. You just reverse it. Here's a fake, here's a real one. Which one is fake and which one's real? And so that's the same. It's the same idea, but he does a lot of interesting things on top of that. But the problem is, it's a cat and mouse game, right? Once you've done this so far, then you now the whole point of deep learning is like, can you fake it? The test is the computer to figure out if it knows which one's real and what's not real. And if it doesn't know which one's real or not real, then it has succeeded. Right?
Yeah.
So
they're called generative adversarial networks, and they're actually built into the same networks at this point.
Right.
The machines are testing themselves as they produce images.
Right.
So yeah, we'll get to the ability to generate images, but then Hollywood has been doing that for, I don't know, you talk to any good compositor and they can, make the grain perfect, make the hue and all the channels from any angle look flawless. So
yeah.
So our idea to manufacture digital humans, I mean, the real-time efforts from DigiDog, and not to be confused with DigiDog in New York, but the real-time humans work from a single frame, and we're getting there on motion. And this isn't even deep machine learning. This is just manufacturing with computer graphics images that are like the gaming technology is doing it at 240 frames a second. So we'll eventually, I mean, if you look at games 5 years ago and 10 years ago and 15 years ago, you can see the progression. And so we will eventually be able to get to pretty easily being able to synthesize reality in a convincing way.
Sure.
For any viewer. Yeah.
Yeah. It's going to be very interesting, for sure.
And luckily most humans are good or not, nefarious.
Right.
And so society will continue to operate and the sky won't fall.
Right.
I think that's my sort of like looking at, I mentioned Plato earlier. I read The Republic recently, a few years ago, and then that interested me in doing a course on it. And the problems that we're going through today are not new. Like these are 2,000.
That's the problem, is that we've been dumbed ourselves down so much that we forgot about history.
Yeah. So it is really interesting. It's sort of comforting in a historical perspective to know that, all through history, people have thought that this problem was going to be the biggest problem and it was going to end us all. And so I grew up with atomic bombs threats in Cold War, and so I think people are good, and we're going to make it through. Yeah.
Well, that sounds great. Speaking of good and make it through, what are your plans for the future?
Well, so we've created a company around this idea of doing identity hiding, veiling people in documentary films, and there's several projects on the whiteboard. They're all terrible. There's a huge amount of stuff going on in the world. Human trafficking, just small villages that have different ways of doing things. I wouldn't even know where to begin on.
It's going to take a toll on you, Ryan.
I mean, philosophy is this idea. Does it take a toll, or do I feel better in the service of others? Right?
Yeah.
That is life, is to be in the service of others and community. And I think it's it's really different than thinking about, a summer blockbuster. Because like I want to get up and go to work every day, even though it is like, oh, it's the terrible situation, but I'm helping the word get out about it, and therefore it will affect change for the better in the world. So yeah, I'm not too worried about. I'm worried about it at this point. I think I don't want to become callous about the things. I mean, I'm here because I have empathy, but I think it also having some ability to help is a fantastic feeling.
Sure. Well, that's fabulous. I'm really glad we're well over an hour, which is perfectly fine because I think we've had some great discussion. You see, we summed up the first part. No, you don't talk too much at all. We summed up the first part really quickly, which we got into a little bit more last time. But I think we really got down to the meat of this project, which I think is, like I said, really, really good and very important. And I've always had a fascination with digital humans. I always felt that digital humans have an extremely important role to play around us. They are not just a replacement or anything to be worried about in some cases. Yes, you need to be concerned about certain things, but they definitely have a role to play. And I think that what you guys are doing is definitely a clear example that I now have in my repertoire of see, look at this amazing stuff that can be done and saves lives in visual effects. It's something, whenever someone says that, now I'll have a clear case of the contrary. So.
Yeah, and I think it is interesting to think for anybody that's in visual effects. I didn't build this product and to go try to pitch it to a director, but being open to solving interesting problems is a really, for anybody in visual effects, because we deal in images and media drives the world.
Right.
Like how just be open to the idea of helping.
Yes.
In a different way that maybe you didn't think of. Back to I've never done it before, but that's never stopped me. Like you said?
Yeah, I didn't say that. That was Andy Weisler who said that.
I mean your first lesson, but
it was great.
Communicated the quote.
Yep, it was a great lesson, and I definitely learned a lot from it. And like I said, I'm still learning, and it's really interesting. And now you're not only learning, you're teaching computers to learn as well.
That's a whole nother fascinating topic.
Yeah, for sure.
Watching a computer learn, we realize how we are products of our environment.
Right.
Like obviously there's some wiring, but also when the machines get it wrong, they get it wrong in these really interesting ways.
Yep.
That shows you that they're trying to make sense of this new information that they didn't have.
Right.
And they can only map it to information that they do have.
Right.
And it really sums up how people are programmed by information. And you can't see something, people can't see something new. We, not people, other people, we.
Right.
We can only adapt what we know. We can only apply the information that we've learned to a new situation to help us understand it. And that clouds perception of anything.
Yeah, I don't want to get too political, but clearly when you see two paths on a social network that have different ideologies, they've been trained by different networks and different data sets. So that it's impossible.
Algorithms.
It's impossible for them to understand how the other sees the way they do.
Yeah.
So yep, you have to sort of cross-pollinate in order for them to come to an understanding.
Now there's an idea that I if I had any spare time right now, which I don't, so I'm just going to put this out there. If anybody is interested in it, GPT-2, GPT-3, these language models. How come nobody's trained a language model to close that gap?
Right.
Go into your bot is watching Twitter and it sees an argument. And it goes in and it smooths out the argument like a mediator. Why are there not mediator bots? There's flame bots, but there aren't any mediator bots. I feel like we need an army of mediator bots just to go, all right, well, I appreciate your point of view.
Right. Or if your news feed or your interests come up, try feeding in a little bit of the other side of that interest so you can get a little bit of something different,
Yeah,
So-
there is actually I think there's a either a browser plugin or something. I saw something, somebody had done something like this where it would like give me like it, or I think it's called Both Sides. I
Right.
could be wrong on that, but
Yeah.
for any topic you get stories
Yep.
from different media sources. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, that's interesting. All right. Well, Ryan, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We
I do appreciate it as
won't-
well.
We won't be able to go to the real-time conference in person because it's virtual, but it's nice to hang out with you here, and I'm sure we'll hang out with you, quote unquote, online. Technically speaking, the real-time conference is happening next week, so you'll be presenting next week. So I'm excited about that.
Very excited to do that. Yeah.
And I will also, but when I'm finally fully inoculated or as inoculated as I feel comfortable, we should definitely get together and hang out and catch up with a lot of stories for sure.
Love it. Love the idea. Maybe by the beach.
Maybe by the beach. I go to the beach a lot these days because of my fishing habits. So that's what it's. So
I can't wait to see how fly fishing works in the surf.
Yeah. All right. Have a good one, Ryan.
Okay, you too.